Lone Rider here, and just wanted to talk about a few things related to Watchung and Union County and its ban on mountain biking. And that is, in particular, why I had to sue the government. Um, now, people always joke about, you piss me off, I'll sue you. Um, the problem is there sometimes is a legitimate purpose to lawsuits. We tend to forget in all the modern day hullabaloo about, somebody pours hot coffee on her crotch and then sues McDonald's, or some idiot's texting on his phone and then crashes and kills somebody else. And he decides, rather than the fact that, oh, well, I should be more responsible when I drive, he's going to sue, the Apple Corporation or something. Uh, these things happen. And it's enough that it's become a cliche. You know, the story about the guy who breaks in your house, and then while he's prowling around looking to steal your belongings, he trips on something and falls and hurts himself and tries to sue you. There's a reason that these things have become a cliche, is because there is some truth to it. However, it is worth noting that the flip side is sometimes there's a purpose to lawsuits. And one of those is the Oprah lawsuit, or the Open Public Records Act lawsuit. Um, You've heard of the Freedom of Information Act. At the federal level, people can request official government documents. The Open Records Act is essentially the state level version here in New Jersey. So if you want to know what your town or county or state government is doing, and they're not telling you, you can file an Oprah request, as it's called, or Open Public Records Act request. And I did that all the way through the effort with Watchung. Just to recap, mountain biking has been banned in Watchung since 1995. A bunch of government guys got together in a back room without any public input. These were unelected officials, and they decided to create a ban out of whole cloth. It's worth noting they also had no documentation of a single instance of a problem with mountain biking at Watchung. And these are all, this is all from the government's own responses to my Open Record Act requests, which spanned basically 3 years. No, I started looking into this because I was a bicyclist and still am, and I wanted to be able to ride my bike in the park, that was closest to my house. I couldn't understand, I'd ridden there years ago as a teenager, and I couldn't understand why is it when you have the biggest park in the county, the crown jewel supposedly of the Union County park system. Why, one, hardly anybody ever seems to use a lot of it, and two, if that's the case, how come there isn't room to share? I was also a little curious. In July of 2014, somebody had written an article in the Star Ledger, and the article was on the subject of several local riders who likewise didn't understand why mountain biking was banned and were trying to get park access. Now, in this article, you had, again, a handful of guys. I think they mentioned 2 people. And one fella from a mountain biking lobby group. Now, the 2 local riders and the guy from the mountain biking advocacy group, they were quoted in this newspaper article, it spanned 2 pages. It wasn't a full 2 pages, but it started on one page and went on to the next. And it took up like the top half of the, Union County section in the Star Ledger, which was a major regional New Jersey newspaper at the time. This was a big article. And the purpose of the article was to describe people who were trying to, this was what it was about. Okay, this wasn't a periphery in the article. It wasn't like the article was about Watchung Park generally, and they decided to throw in, oh, and by the way, there's a handful of people who want to be able to ride their bikes there. No, it was, the whole point of the article was that people wanted to be able to ride their bikes there, and when a handful of them approached the government, they couldn't get a straight answer as to why they weren't allowed to. The article even contained the county spokesman, Sebastian Delia, who was quoted as saying he had no idea why mountain bikes were banned. Wait a minute. Your job is county spokesman. Essentially, you're there to promote and advocate for county's government policy at the county level. So if the county government makes a decision or implements a policy or passes a law or ordinance prohibiting something, such as, for example, mountain biking, hello, it's your job to be able to articulate clearly and concisely not only the reasons for it, but the logic behind it. So if the reason, for example, is, well, people were complaining about mountain bikers. You'd have to go into that. You have to explain, the complaints had substance, essentially. That it wasn't just somebody didn't want to share with somebody else, or somebody thought somebody else was rude, or some other subjective thing, which is, basically complete and utter meaninglessness. I mean, anybody can be defined as rude according to some standard. That's why rudeness isn't a crime, because it's impossible to prove, right? So, the whole idea that they would just ban something, and then the county spokesman would say, well, I have no idea why it's banned, which is what happened. Essentially, he confessed complete and total fracking ignorance. He essentially said he had no idea why it was banned, and, well, it's just been that way for a long time. Yeah, and? I mean, the whole article is about people trying to undo the ban, but there was no mention of any actual ban in terms of a law or an ordinance or a decision that was made. Nobody ever said, we're trying to overturn ordinance XYZ. We're trying to get them to amend or repeal section 246 of ordinance XYZ, because that's the thing that regulates riding your mountain bike in Watchung Reservation, or prohibits you from riding your bike on the trails in Watchung Reservation. And no ordinance or law or other legislation was mentioned. They never even explained how, well, if it wasn't an ordinance or law that was passed in 1995, if, as it turned out to be when I got involved and started digging this up, if it was in fact a bunch of unelected goons who got together in a back room and just decided, by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned. Okay, if that's what happened, who were those people? What was their authority? Under whose auspices were they meeting? And, what evidence did they look at to determine that mountain biking should in fact be banned? Was there a trail study done? Was there documentation of trail damage? Police reports of collisions with injuries? What happened, essentially? And we have a big nothing from this article. So, like any astute, rational observer, I'm reading this news article about people trying to get the ban on mountain biking overturned. And I just kind of figured sooner or later I'd get to the part where they talked about an actual ban on mountain biking. I mean, it just seemed like they would at some point. But they didn't. So I started looking at this, and finally I said to somebody, I said, look, I just read this huge newspaper article on people trying to get the ban on mountain biking overturned. And, obviously it drew my attention because somebody who had ridden there back in the day, my last year of high school, and still bicycles, I thought it would be kind of cool to be able to ride my mountain bike, basically in the place where I rode in the old days, as it were. But I said, in this whole two-page article, there's not a single mention of any actual law or ordinance banning mountain biking, or any ban on mountain biking. The whole thing that they're talking about, we're trying to work to get mountain biking back into the park, but in the entire two-page article, there's not a single mention of anything that's keeping them from doing that. Not a single mention of a ban, a law, an ordinance, nothing. So how exactly are they going about working for this? I mean, for example, if there's a law that says you can't do it, then you have to either, work to amend the law or have it repealed. If there's an ordinance, same thing. If there's an ordinance that says you can't ride your bike in Watchung, mountain bike, or you can't ride your bike on the trails at Watchung Reservation Park in the woods, then you have to get them to change that. If there's no ordinance and somebody just made this decision at, let's say, an administrative level, rather than a legislative level, then what authorized them to do that, and is it proper? Does it have a method of appealing it, challenging it? Do they have to present evidence? In other words, is it just their say-so, or is there some structure so that you don't have somebody become like a petty dictator of the park, as is wont to happen with some of these bureaucracies? And obviously, if it's some structure, there would also be then a method to maybe question it, and it would tell you who to talk to and so forth. If it's just somebody, we don't know, somebody just decided by the power of Grayskull, bikes are banned, then it's a different story. Then you don't know who to talk to. You don't know under what rule it was done or what authority. There's no ordinance or law you can challenge to say to your, let's say, your legislative body, in the county case, the freeholders, Mr. Freeholder, please repeal this ordinance because we've seen in the intervening 20 years, mountain biking is accepted at most other state parks and county parks throughout New Jersey, and there's not a problem with it. And this ban was never really justified in the first place. It may have been a knee-jerk reaction to some people complaining about perceived problems with a handful of riders, but we know from the government's own records that there was never any documentation of a problem with mountain biking at Watchung. And that the decision was imposed in secret in a backroom meeting. So given all of that, except wait, if the decision was imposed in secret at a backroom meeting by the unelected, as is what happened in this case, why are you writing the freeholders? They can't affect this. They never passed a law or ordinance, right? And that's kind of a little bit of the history of this. It turns out that since I couldn't get a straight answer from anybody, I couldn't find, much like those people in the news article couldn't get a straight answer. And then I ended up reading the over 280-page county code. Stupid me, I figured that if there's got to be a law or ordinance banning mountain biking somewhere, right? Well, it turned out there wasn't. Well, that's awfully odd, isn't it? Yeah, and then when I finally got the results to my first series of Open Record Act requests, and it had to be a series because they couldn't answer a straight question. I mean, just the fact that I asked for the ordinance or law that banned mountain biking, the minutes of the meeting, and all the other stuff related to its passage, which would include notice to citizens to provide input, the minutes of the meeting, discussions, etc. What I got back was, well, we don't have anything to show you because the freeholders never acted to ban mountain biking. Now, that's important. Remember that. But then they turn around and said, well, but there was this old ordinance that was passed to ban mountain biking. I'm confused. On one hand, they're saying the freeholders, who are the legislative body at the county level, the ones who pass ordinances, they never acted to ban mountain biking. And the act in question is clearly the passage of an ordinance, because they use that to sort of get into the whole, well, we don't have anything to provide you about the passage of an ordinance. There's no paper trail. There's no minutes of a meeting. There's no results of a vote. There's no notice published to the citizens because they never passed an ordinance to ban mountain biking. Okay. But then they turn around and say, well, there was this old ordinance on the books. Okay, so who passed that? Wouldn't that then be the ordinance? Now, you could have it on and say, well, maybe they meant the freeholders didn't pass an ordinance or a law in 1995. And we know they didn't. It was a bunch of unelected goons. But the point is that I wasn't asking about 1995. I was just asking, when was mountain biking banned? Right? I mean, if the ban was from 1895, then tell me that. What happened here was they came with, well, we don't have anything to tell you, but, there was no ordinance passed, there was no law passed. Oh, but there was this old ordinance passed. So that's the ordinance then, that banned mountain biking, isn't it? Okay, then tell me all the stuff about that ordinance that I asked for. Because that was what I put into my Open Public Records Act request. So they say, well, on one hand, there was no law passed, but then they turn around and they say there was a law passed. But then they turn around and they say we don't have anything to provide you about the passage of the law that we would be required to create and then maintain as records if we in fact passed a law. And they never say which law it is even. So it's not even like you can look it up and see, well, what does it say? Is it really about mountain biking? Whatever. The second thing they had in there was they had something about how mountain bikes were ruining the park, and it's interesting to say, by way of clarification is how they introduced this. Dan Bernier, one of the guys who works at the Parks Department, has typed up a paragraph to explain to you what happened. Now, I later found out Dan Bernier, who lives in the park in one of the historic buildings and hates mountain bikers, that he was one of the figures that was instrumental in getting the ban on mountain biking imposed back in the 90s. And he still works for the county to this day, and he still lives in the park, which seems to me to be a major conflict of interest if you're shaping park policy and you live in the fracking park, like Yogi Bear or something. I mean, really. But they say, by way of clarification, Daniel Beer typed up this paragraph. These guys need a remedial English lesson, I think, because clarification refers to something to be clarified. But they just got done saying, we have nothing to provide you whatsoever, and then provided two contradictory statements. One, that there was no legislation enacted to ban mountain biking. Two, that there was legislation enacted, we just won't tell you what. There's essentially, therefore, nothing to clarify, right? I mean, what is this? What does this clarify of which you speak? But they say, well, we want by way of clarification. There's nothing to clarify because you haven't provided any information. Hello, McFly. Anybody home? But to give the devil its due, I read the paragraph. And then I sat there and said, okay, so where's the rest of the shit I asked for? The reason being, I read the paragraph, and what it said was that prior to 1995, there was already an ordinance on the books that banned mountain biking on the trails in the park. We decided to not enforce that. I guess they just arbitrarily can decide which laws they choose to obey or not. I don't know how that works. I always thought if there's a legitimate law in the books, you kind of have to enforce it. But I guess they just figure, well, you know, we're gonna. This is legislation a la carte. We're just gonna take what we want and leave the rest. So he said, well, we just decided to arbitrarily stop enforcing it for a few years, and then enforcement was simply resumed arbitrarily again in 1995. So there was no paper trail because we just did all this shit on our own arbitrarily, like. They do throw in a statement about, or he throws in a statement to the effect that there was damage either to the trails or the environment, they don't specify, but damage in the park of some kind and injuries. Now, my problem is I specifically asked for any documentation of trail damage, trail user conflict, or any trail studies. So if there was damage, I expect to see photographs of the damage, a written report of the damage with dates and times and locations within the park. Not just somebody saying, hey, I saw damage, but we don't know who that person is or where they wrote it down or whatever. No, I expect to see an actual verifiable document that explains where the damage is, who's making the observation that it's there, maybe even a picture. You know, we have this new thing called photography now. We had it back in the 90s too. And then obviously anything with an injury, then you're getting into serious territory. But the thing is, injuries get documented. If somebody really is hurt, beyond just falling down and maybe skidding their knee or, oh man, I twisted, my ankle, I'm going to go put ice on it. Even there, I mean, if it's an ankle, you might want to go to the doctor. I didn't with mine when I fell down and twisted my ankle. And it was sore for several weeks. But yeah, if you're talking a serious injury rather than just somebody who is in minor physical pain for, let's say 20 minutes because they got a bruise. But if you're talking like a broken arm or a broken finger or dislocated shoulder or, something serious, that person needs to go to a physician or an emergency room or a doctor or even have an ambulance summoned. Well, if you're talking injury in that sense, and that's apparently what they were talking, they said serious injury, uh, where's the documentation of that? Where's the 911 tapes? Where's the transcripts of the 911 call? Where's the police report written up? Where's if this was caused by a biker, where's the ticket given to the biker for, injuring somebody? Where's the logs of the call to the ambulance? Where's the records of the ambulance that delivered the person to what hospital? They're at the very least the date that this occurred, the time, and the names of the two parties involved, the bicyclist and the non-bicyclist, or the one party involved if it was, for example, just a bicyclist who crashed into a tree or something. But if you're going to say the bicyclists were injuring themselves and other people, then where's your documentation of that? Because I had asked specifically for that sort of stuff in my Open Records Act request. So he provides this most interesting narrative about, mountain bikers were wrecking the place, and that's why we just arbitrarily decided to ban them and reimpose an ordinance that we just arbitrarily decided to stop enforcing earlier. For what reason? Under what authority? What ordinance even? He doesn't say. I mean, it's like we're in land of make-believe here. But the whole idea of, I specifically asked for documentation of trail damage, user conflict, trail studies, anything like that. You'd think a bicyclist plowing into somebody and breaking their arm, to use one hypothetical example, we don't know. This is all hypothetical as far as has been documented by the government. None of it ever happened. But the point is that then where's your evidence of that? And I pressed them in follow-up Open Record Act requests. I pressed them specifically for source material. You're saying there was a problem with mountain biking at Watchung. Where's your documentation of a problem with mountain biking? And they had to come back and say, we don't have any. But what they did say is, some guy who works for the county, turned out to be Jan Bernier again. It's odd how his name keeps popping up in this. Some guy who works for the county had this file at home, this folder with stuff about mountain biking in it. It's been moved several times over the last 2 decades, but this is kind of all we have. Except it's not something you have, is it? As the county government, it's something he has. I mean, he's a county employee, but this is something he has personally. That's not what I was asking for. All right, I filed the Open Record Act request for government documents, not for something that somebody had in their private files. I mean, this is starting to sound like the Hillary Clinton School of Record Keeping. Now, to be fair, these were sort of about mountain biking. They weren't about Watchung, though, all right? The only things in there, they had 3 anonymous hand-scribbled complaints on index cards. I shit you not, it looked like a 5-year-old wrote them. I mean, my handwriting's messy, but this is atrocious. And they basically said things like, too many bikers annoying hikers on the trail. We don't know who wrote this. We don't know when it was written. We don't know, who the person was that made the complaint. We don't know who the biker or bikers were that this person encountered. We don't know when this happened, under what conditions, what the bikers did or didn't do, what the hiker did or didn't do, etc. ad nauseum. All we know is that some random person, we don't know who the fuck it is, it's anonymous, could even be made up. What if the person running the Trailside Nature Center didn't like bikes? If you have anonymous handwritten complaints, he or she could just alter her handwriting a little bit and write up a bunch of these, right? Maybe that's why it looks so messy. I don't know. I'm just saying, we don't have a name, we don't have a date, we don't have anything. All we know is that some anonymous person allegedly found some other anonymous person or persons rude according to some subjective standard that's never defined by some anonymous person. And it was all written up by some other anonymous person who we don't know. And there are only 3 of them. That's another thing. It's not like they have a whole notebook full of this. They have 3 of these hand-scribbled anonymous complaints that aren't even documentation of whatever supposedly happened in those 3 instances, assuming there were 3 instances. And there's certainly not documentation of a widespread problem at the park. I would argue they're not documentation, period, because there's no names, there's no nothing. We don't know who anybody involved in that was. It could be, John Smith. It could be Gumby. We don't know who the hell these people were because there's no names and there's no nothing really. It's 3 hand-scribbled complaints about an anonymous person who found another anonymous person bothersome, according to some unknown subjective opinion that we don't is never spelled out or whatever what they supposedly did. It's worth noting that in 20 years, those 3 anonymous hand-scribbled complaints are the only things that the government ever bothered to put together about Watchung. They don't have a trail study. They don't have photographs of trail damage or police reports of injuries or anything like that. They have 3 anonymous hand-scribbled complaints about people who found bikers rude or annoying. Now, here's my problem with this. First of all, we don't know that these happened. Since there's no names or anything, we have to kind of look at it as essentially meaningless. It's not documentation. But assume it's true and that there were 3 rude mountain bikers in the park at one time. Well, it could have been 3 separate times. We don't know. But, okay, at one point in time, in the past, there were at least 3 rude mountain bikers. Right? We know there's more than that today, right? I mean, if you've ridden anywhere, you'll know there's assholes in every group. There's jerks in every group. I bike. Most of the time, when I'm riding, most of the stuff that throws me off or that makes me concerned about getting in an accident on the road or the trail is usually non-bikers. So people walking their dog, but the leash is going all the way across the trail. Yeah, that's a scary one. People walking their dog, but it's loose. I love dogs. I don't want to hit one. But I also don't want to get, bit or, run into a tree trying to avoid them. People, running or walking in the woods and they're not aware of their surroundings. They have headphones on that are too loud. I don't have a problem with headphones per se when you're running or even riding a bicycle. As a rule, though, in the woods, I don't use headphones. And that's because ever since this mountain biking ban was imposed in the 90s, I kind of became a roadie by default. And so I spent a lot of time doing road riding for 20 years. I still mountain biked occasionally in the woods, but nothing big. And then as a result of that, I became very attenuated to hearing cars overtaking by sound. So even listening to the radio or CD, whatever, we didn't have MP3s back then, I could I had it set at a moderate level, usually left one ear open, and I could hear when the car was going to overtake me by sound and time it. So I don't have a problem with people using headphones responsibly on the road. It's more of an issue in the woods for me because, again, being a roadie for years, I'm used to listening for cars. There aren't cars in the woods, but there shouldn't be. So, what you're listening for instead of maybe footsteps, brake squeal on an oncoming bike, the barking of a dog, things like that. Neighing of a horse. I think they neigh, right? That's the sound they make, neigh. Yeah, the neighing of a horse. So these are the things you want to listen for. If you've trained yourself to listen for a car, tire, and engine noise, that's not going to be very helpful. So I as a rule, when I'm mountain biking, I don't listen to my headphones. I don't have a problem with people biking or again, running or whatever and listening to headphones if they're responsible. But obviously in the woods, what you're listening for is a different type of thing than what you listen for on the road. And therefore, it's up to you to be like, well, I haven't trained myself to do that, so I'm not going to. That's what I do. If I'm mountain biking, I don't listen to headphones when I'm mountain biking because, first of all, I'm there to experience the woods. And secondly, the stuff I have to listen for is harder to hear and stuff that I haven't trained myself to listen for, like I have with road noises. So that's that. But yeah, if you have somebody who's on their headphones and are not paying attention, and it's like, okay, I'm trying to pass, but I don't see any acknowledgement that you hear me coming, and I've said on your left or rang my bell or whatever like a zillion times now, what do? I mean, I could stop and wait or I could try to pass, but if I try to pass and there's a mishap, you will blame me. Why? Because you think it's your God-given right to be fucking oblivious. Go figure. People are stupid. But there are also sometimes stupid people on bikes. And I've seen, every once in a while, there'll be that pedestrian that's being an asshole or whatever. Lewis Morris, there were two guys that stopped to chat on a narrow wooden plank bridge. And I was looking at it and I was like, I can't ride through that. Somebody's going into the stream if I try to ride through that. So I dismounted, put my bike on my outside shoulder, walked on like the very edge of the bridge around them, and then put the bike down and then rode on. Now, as I just finished up crossing the bridge, coming the other way were two mountain bikers who just kind of figured, well, they'll get out of our way, and they didn't. And there wasn't a collision, but there was a real scary close call where these two people who were standing talking, completely obstructing this narrow bridge, which it's a really stupid place to talk. But the point is, because they're being suicidal morons doesn't mean you have to be a maniac, right? You could walk past and tell them they should move. Tell them it's not safe. But don't like chance hitting them. It's like not worth it. That's what happened, however. These guys came barging through, and they not only nearly hit these two clueless morons on the bridge, they nearly hit me, who was dismounted precisely because of the two clueless morons on the bridge, and I didn't want to risk having an accident with them. So I had dismounted my bike to walk around. And of course, as I was mounting up, these two guys come barreling down. And, fortunately, I just fell into some thorn bushes and rolled around. I wasn't badly hurt. The two guys on the bridge managed to move out of the way just enough that the bikes got through. But, it's a cautionary tale. The morons shouldn't have stopped to talk blocking a bridge. All right? But you shouldn't become a moron yourself and risk hitting them. All right? Walk around them. It gives you, if nothing else, slowing or stopping to walk around them gives you an opportunity to tell them, hey, you shouldn't be standing here. You're going to get somebody hurt. Maybe yourself. But the point is that there were assholes in every group. Those obviously were two asshole hikers, or dog walkers, I think, in that case. But you also had the two asshole mountain bikers. Now, it's kind of pointless to argue. You could argue, well, if those people weren't standing cluelessly blocking the bridge, what the mountain bikers did wouldn't have been asshole-ish, to use a word. Maybe. But the point is that you also have to be aware of your surroundings. As much as those morons should be aware of their surroundings and not block the bridge, you as a cyclist should be aware of your surroundings and not want to risk hitting the moron or yourself. So there are some route bikers. We know that. But there are also route hikers or dog walkers, whatever. The fact that there's a handful of rude people in any group, should that be a reason to outlaw that group from using a public resource? I mean, just think about this for a second. Look at Watchung Reservation. The only time I have ever seen anybody walk their dog on a leash in Watchung Reservation is when they're not on the trail. When they're emerging from the trail and they're coming out to the street or to a trailhead, the dogs are often, although not always, on leashes. Once they get into the woods and they're back in the trail, the dogs are almost always off the leash. I have never, literally never, in all the time I've been hiking and biking there. And it's worth noting that I did bike there relatively recently when there was a period of about 8 months when the signs were taken down, the no bike signs, and then they were put back. New ones were made and put back up about 8 months later. So they were taken down in December of, I think, 2015, and they were put up in like August of 2016. And, for over half a year, people were riding there, including myself, because we thought at this point, we've been working with the government to try and get trail access, and we kind of figured they were just following through on their promises. And I did hear from somebody at one point that who apparently heard it from somebody with, I don't know, the county government or something, that the signs were officially taken down. By the county police or something. So Yeah, I rode there, and during the time I rode there, I also hiked there. Now, I haven't been back there as a bicyclist since they put the new no bike signs up, and I haven't been back there as a hiker either. I'm going to be brutally honest. If I want to hike in a place, I don't want to hike in a place that's as, you know, as far as I'm concerned, is the moral equivalent for trail access of North Korea. You know, there are better places to go, all right, that have fair policy. They might be further away, they might be in other counties, but basically, as long as Union County refuses to acknowledge reality um, and have some trail access for mountain biking, I'm not going to use Union County park facilities. So, I mean, another thing I do, I'm an archer, I do archery. There's a Union County archery range that's a lot closer than the range that I go to. Here's the problem though, it's a Union County range. Why would I want to utilize any of their facilities? Okay? Knowing how they treat myself and other riders, why would I put myself in that position of essentially supporting them? No, no, I'm going to go and drive for an hour and 20 minutes it's worth it for me to sleep at night, to drive for an hour and 20 minutes to another archery range. Or 40, it's 45 minutes to an hour and 20, depending on the traffic. Same thing with mountain biking. There are some people who still occasionally ride there on the sly, trusting their chances, I guess, figuring, maybe they'll be lax enforcing it this day, or maybe I'll just get lucky. To me, basing trail access on lax enforcement or the vagaries of enforcement or just dumb luck, that's not enough, okay? That's not what I call trail access. So I ride at other places. I'll go to Lewis Morris or um, 6 Mile Run, places like that. Um, I haven't been back as a biker, and I haven't been back as a hiker to watch it. But when I was biking and hiking there, I did see, excuse me, too much coffee this morning. I did see when I was biking and hiking there a lot of people with dogs. Not a single one of them was on a leash. That to me is telling. So, like, if you wanted to enforce the rules, start with the rules that are clear, not the rules that are questionable, like this thing about mountain biking. Start with the rules that are clear, like it very clearly says your dog has to be on a leash. Now, what does the ordinance they say ban mountain biking say? We're getting to that. In follow-up Open Records Act request, I got a little bit of information. I asked for documentation of a problem with mountain biking, and of course there was none. There were those 3 anonymous hand-scribbled things, and then there were 2 other things. There were 3 newspaper articles from the popular press about people denouncing bikers at other parks. None of this was about Watchung, and one of the parks, in one of the articles, was as far away as Stamford, Connecticut. I mean, this had nothing to do with Watchung. There was a trail study that's since been more or less discredited, but it was of 2 trails, atypically larger trails, I should say, or wider trails. It was a double track that was wider than most of the normal trails in the woods, in another park in another county. So not only were these trails going to get more and heavier usage, obviously, because they were wider, so they'd appeal to more variety of uses and skill levels, but they also, this wasn't in Watchung. This was in some park in Essex County. So what did it have to do with Watchung? It didn't. It not only had nothing to do with Watchung, it also post-dated the decision to ban us by almost a year. Well, then how could it have been source material? It couldn't. The whole point is that none of this was source material for anything, at least as far as Watchung is concerned. They didn't have a single documented thing. But yet, apparently, it was so widespread that there was, as a problem, that there was nothing anybody could do except ban mountain biking. For such a widespread problem, there's evidence is pretty thin on the ground to say non-existent. I mean, if it was such a widespread problem, how come there's not a single police report of a collision? There's not a single, photograph of trail damage, whatever. And how come when people at public meetings arguing over whether or not to allow mountain biking now, or at least last year, How come when people at these public meetings said things like, well, there were all these horrible injuries, none of the mountain bikers got up and said, well, we have the government's so-called documentation, and there's not a single injury that ever happened? I don't know. It amazes me. You know, the Open Public Record Act request isn't optional. The government is required, if they have the information, to turn it over. There are some exceptions for like privacy information and stuff like that. It's anything that's still deliberative. But as far as stuff, existing government records, if they have it, they're required to turn it over. So you can't say, well, maybe they had it, they just didn't disclose it. No, if they have it at all, they're required to disclose it. So this is a very easy thing to figure out. If I ask for the information with an Open Records Act request and they do not provide it, then legally they don't have it. And they can't come back later and say, oh, well, but there were all these injuries. I asked for documentation of any injuries. You didn't provide any. You can't now just say there were injuries. Oh, for the love of Christ. I mean, this is the type of thing that, when people talk about their government being conducted in a dishonorable manner, this is the type of thing they mean. And that includes not just, this lack of evidence and all of that stuff, but the aspect of the ordinance. Remember the ordinance where they said on one hand, well, there was no law passed, but then on the other hand, well, there was a law passed, it was just old, and we're not going to tell you about it. Yeah, that ordinance. So the first time that ordinance was linked in writing by name or ordinance number, specifically as that ordinance, to the 1995 ban on mountain biking, and it's worth noting that the ban is from 1995. We'll get to that in a second. The first time this was linked to the ban on mountain biking, this ordinance, was in 2014. Okay. Now, in contemporaneous memos and stuff in the 90s, they had talked about an old ordinance, but they never said which one. And the stuff they said the ordinance referred to, like the word trail, don't appear in it. Okay. The ordinance says it regulates riding your bicycle on roads, sidewalks, paths, and says you shouldn't block cars. And in that instance, I think it uses the word motor vehicle or vehicle, but the context is clearly, roadway traffic, cars, trucks, buses, things like that. Now, so it regulates riding on the road, sidewalk, path, and says you shouldn't obstruct cars. Does any of that sound like it has to do with mountain biking on narrow dirt trails in the woods to you? Because it doesn't sound like that to me. You might hem and haw over just past mean trail, but first of all, you can't just take one thing out of an ordinance out of context. You have to look at the whole ordinance. Secondly, even if you're going to do that, you're still stuck with the fact that they're listed on county maps as trails and have been for years, and the county was referring to trails. But this ordinance doesn't contain the word trail. See, if they actually did mean the same thing, there'd be no reason to misquote the ordinance. To defend the misquoting of the ordinance by saying, well, the words mean the same thing, even though they don't, beggars the question, then why did they misquote the ordinance? If I raise the objection, they've been saying for 20 years that this ordinance talks about bikes on trails, but it doesn't. The word trail isn't even in the ordinance, in fact. If they were to come back with, well, when they talk about paths and sidewalks, they mean trails. Then you have two questions. One, then why didn't they put the word trail in there if that's what they meant? Because we all kind of know paths and sidewalks doesn't mean trail. And then secondly, and if they did mean paths and sidewalks, then why have they been saying trails? If they really do mean the same thing, then on one hand, that might justify misquoting the ordinance, because then you could say, well, it's not misquoting it. But on the other hand, if they really do mean the same thing, then there's no reason to misquote it. Just say path and sidewalk. Everybody will know you mean trail. Oh, wait, they won't, will they? Because they do mean different things. Yeah, that's the problem. But then you have the fact that this ordinance is from 1983. The ban on mountain biking, as the government revealed in its own Open Records Act request, was created in 1995. And it was done, according to the county's own words, quote, without any public input, unquote. Not good. So it was done by the unelected in an end run around our electoral process without passing any law or legislation. So how did this old ordinance from 1983 come into it? Well, they never said which ordinance. But what they did say is that they disallowed mountain biking for 2 years. So they banned mountain biking in 1983 by passing this ordinance. Or I should say this ordinance authorized a ban on mountain biking, whatever that means. Then they decided to allow mountain biking from 1993 through 95. And then in 95, they arbitrarily decided to resume enforcement of that ordinance. So that was a statement they made in 2014, and it was the first time that in the follow-up Oprah request, when they explicitly said which ordinance it was, that was the first time in over 20 years, basically since that ordinance was written, I think, that it was ever linked in writing to the 1995 ban on mountain biking. The first time in over 20 years that it was linked. Now, if it was really the authorization for the ban, wouldn't there have been something in writing in 1995 referencing this ordinance? There wasn't. They did say an old ordinance and some contemporaneous things, but again, they never said which one, and they referred to the ordinance containing words like trail, which aren't in this ordinance. So the first time they ever referred to this ordinance specifically in any way, rather than just say an old ordinance or say an old ordinance that refers to trails, which this one doesn't, was in 2014. But the ordinance is from 1983, and the ban on mountain biking is from 1995. So how come there's no earlier reference? Well, I don't think the ordinance actually authorized the ban. I think it was pretty much what we all kind of realize now, that a bunch of unelected goons got together in a back room and decided we're just going to pretend there's a law. Which would explain why the ordinance, I mean, if there's going to be any question, in the 1990s, mountain biking was contentious. It was no less contentious here, which shows you, I think, how little people have grown and how little they've learned since 1995, some of the mountain biking opponents. I mean, their knowledge of cycling seems to be limited to a 90s Mountain Dew commercial. But be that as it may, here's the deal. These people, they knew it was going to be a contentious thing. So if they were concerned that it was going to be contentious, why didn't they try to make it clear and say, let's have a vote, let's go to the freeholders and have them amend the ordinance to put something either about mountain biking by name or bikes on the trails in the park so it's clear to people. And then we can also, allow the public to have a say and all of that like they're supposed to. Nope, got to do it in the back room of the meeting of the unelected, who, by the way, don't pass ordinances. And that, I think, is why I think what happened afterwards is they were just casting around for something to justify this and settled on this ordinance. But they were never pinned down because nobody ever got to the point of asking them, well, what's the ordinance? And I think that's awfully interesting that for 20 years, the government could tell people something was against the law when it wasn't, and nobody asked them to be specific. Nobody said, well, okay, show me the ordinance. What does it say? When was it passed? Nothing. I think that's awfully strange. That I can't be the first person in 20 years to have thought, well, okay, what's the legal basis for this policy? And then to find out that there is none. So the government really has just been pretending there's a law for 20 years. That's pretty sad, right? Well, on the heels of this, we started working with mountain biking advocacy groups, including this Jorba group, Jersey Off-Road Bicycling Association, to get trail access in the county. And I was always coming from the perception that, the ban was never legitimate in the first place. So this wasn't about mountain biking. This wasn't about is mountain biking safe or good for the environment or any of that shit. This was about the government's policy and how it was implemented. That it was done without any documentation of a problem, that it was done behind closed doors without any public input, that it was done by repurposing an old ordinance after the fact for whatever reason. And we know it was repurposed because, as far as the history of the ban's concerned, you've got like 4 different timelines. They say on one hand the ban is from 1983 when this ordinance was passed about roads and sidewalks and paths. So that's number one. Number two, they say it was banned in 1983 when this ordinance from 1983 was passed. But then in 1993, we decided to arbitrarily suspend enforcing that and allow riding for 2 years. And then in 1995, mountain biking was banned. Then you have the statement they made in May 18th of 2017 in an NJ.com article where the government said it was banned in 1983. Well, they didn't say that, but they said it was allowed from 1994 through 1995. So we don't know when it was banned according to that, or if that sidewalk ordinance had anything to do with it. But we do know that according to that, it was allowed from 94 through 95. And in the same article, somebody from the government was quoted as saying, it's unclear why it was banned. Okay. And then you have the mountain biking white paper. The mountain biking white paper. So according to this, it's banned in 1983. According to this, it's banned in 83, but it's allowed 93 through 95. According to this, it's banned whenever, and it's allowed 94 through 95. And nobody is sure exactly, or so they say, why it was banned. Then you have the mountain biking white paper. This is, I think, the closest you can get to the truth. I know it sounds like an X-Files thing, but this is the closest we can get to the truth because this is the closest in time. The mountain biking white paper was written in 1995, around the time the ban was created. What a white paper is a document arguing for the creation or change of a government policy. So, first of all, you have to ask if the ban is originally from 1983 and enforcement in 1995 was just being resumed after a hiatus. Why isn't the mountain biking white paper from 1983 when the ban was initially created, if that's when it was created, according to this old ordinance? For which they still haven't, to this day, provided the notice published and all the other stuff. The second thing is the mountain biking white paper itself. It opens with the sentence, mountain biking and Watchung reservation has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Now, this was in 1995. And notice he doesn't say occasional sporadic riding by people who sneak in, surreptitiously, illegally, and ride. No, he says mountain biking and Watchung has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. If you had any policy in place at all that was being, enforced and actively, implemented against mountain biking, there'd be no way you could say that it dramatically increased over the last 5 years. It just doesn't make sense. So we know that at least going back to 1990, because that's the last 5 years, the period of dramatic increase. How long has it been going on before that? We don't know. But we know at least prior to 1990. So it could be 1989, could be 1980, we don't know. But at least prior to 1990, because 95 through 90 is 5 years, that would be the period of dramatic increase. So we know it goes back to at least 1989. That would be the earliest you could go and still be just past 5 years. After all, the 5 years is only the period of dramatic increase. But then, so we know that it wasn't banned prior to that. But then, as if to drive the point home, he says in his mountain biking white paper that in 1993, an interim trail plan was created to officially recognize mountain biking, the mountain biking that had been ongoing in the park for some time, as an alternative to prohibiting it. Now think about the significance of that statement. They were considering prohibiting mountain biking, but instead they decided to officially incorporate it into the park's program. Oh, isn't that nice? But also think about this. If they were considering banning mountain biking in 1993, then mountain biking wasn't already banned in 1993. Which means that in conjunction with the statement that mountain biking has dramatically increased over the last 5 years, i.e. at least going back to 1989, this has to be looked at as contemporaneous documentation written by Daniel Benier of the Parks Department himself, ironically enough, proving that there was no ban in effect, at least going back to 1989. So for the government to say, well, it was banned in 83 and then we just arbitrarily allowed it for 3 years or 2 years, whatever, or 1 year, depending on who you talk to. Yeah, but not according to what was written at the time in 1995, I should say. Yeah, so, and I think the very fact that there are at least three or four divergent timelines for this. Was it banned in 83, banned in 83, and then allowed 93 through 95, allowed 94 through 95, and the government's not sure why they banned it? Or was it that there just was no ban until the ban was arbitrarily created in a backroom meeting by a handful of the unelected in 1995, as indicated by the mountain biking white paper showing that there was no ban prior to at least 1989, and specifically saying that in 1993 they considered banning mountain biking but decided not to and officially incorporated it into the program instead. And that then the ban, of course, was created in 1995 by the unelected. So when you consider all of this, it's kind of no surprise that up until 2014, that 1983 ordinance had never actually been linked in writing to the 1995 mountain bike ban. I mean, it kind of makes sense. They kept all of this under their hat. But here's another thing to think about. I said I had to sue the government. Why did I have to sue the government? Because after 3 years of saying that they would work with us and provide trail access, it was just around the corner, even going so far as to hire a consultant, CME Associates, to design a trail plan. They turned around and they said, oh, sorry. In May of 2017, they got a vote to cancel the mountain biking part of the trail plan. Now, what they never did was change the contract. So they had approved the trail plan, and then they had approved an amended contract, which paid the consultant, who had already been paid something like $43,000 in additional, tens of thousands of taxpayer dollars, specifically just for the mountain bike part of the trail plan. Except the way they wrote that contract, we later found out, was so vague that it never said what they had to do to get the money, and it never said anything specifically about mountain biking, something about additional work. But we were all told that that was specifically for the mountain biking part of the trail plan. Irregardless, the trail plan was then canceled. They had a vote, and they brought in all these hysterical people who said things like, well, mountain bikers will destroy the park, and what if they kidnap my children? I really don't understand the logic there. One person said something like she thought we were going to tromp all the turtles to death. I find these characterizations frankly offensive. But I find the fact that the government was willing to listen to them even more offensive. You have two people who want something, and I understand the government, they kind of have to make it look like they're listening to everybody because they don't want to lose votes. Here's a problem, though. On one side of the issue, you have knowledgeable people who understand. Obviously, they have their own, I don't want to say bias, but their own interest. I want to be able to ride my bike in the park, obviously. So that's my interest. That's my slant on it. But on the other hand, being a biker, I know a hell of a lot more about mountain biking than those guys. We had one guy who got up there and was saying that he thought, like 35 or 40 miles an hour was a typical cruising speed on a mountain bike on off-road, narrow dirt trails. Now, maybe on like a dedicated downhill course, but I've never seen. Now, that might be a typical cruising speed downhill on a road bike. I mean, I've gotten up to nearly 50 miles an hour on my road bike going down steep hills. But we're not talking road cycling. We're talking riding in the woods. Now, somebody did point out, well, maybe this guy just saw a post on Strava about riding through the one road that goes through Skytop Drive, the one road that goes through Watchung Reservation. And he's so ignorant of cycling, he just doesn't know that that's not a speed you would know. That has to be from a road ride. There's no way somebody get up to that speed on a mountain bike on those trails in the condition that the trails are in. Maybe. But the fact that whether they're making these statements because they're ignorant or because they're malicious, the point is the statements are wrong. And what they illustrate, I think, is that these people are very ignorant of cycling. I mean, it's kind of like when you get a guy who wants to ban guns, get up there and he says something like fully automatic, military style, semi-automatic assault weapon. Now, I don't know about you, but there's about 5 different things in that statement, and they all contradict each other. There is no such thing. It doesn't exist. Um, Now, that's not to say this person might have a legitimate fear of guns being misused or whatever. Maybe he's not just some asshole know-it-all who doesn't know anything who wants to take your stuff away. Maybe he really does feel that this is, you know what? That's fine. I don't understand where you get to the point where his feelings somehow become like a fact that have to be acted on with legislation. I don't understand where you get to the point that because his feelings are pure, we could just ignore the fact that everything he's said about firearms is wrong and base laws on them. And the fact that, okay, so maybe you want to act like you're listening to him so you don't lose his vote. But then what about all the people whose rights are going to be violated when you take away their stuff because of arguments that are wrong based on words spoken by the ignorant who don't even understand what they're talking about? Yeah, it's kind of like that. When somebody gets up there and starts talking about fully semi-automatic military-style assault weapons, I know right away they know nothing about guns. Which begs the question, then why should they be in a position of making the regulations for them? Or suggesting the regulations to be made, etc. Yeah, I don't think we should have policy based on ignorance. So what really annoys me, it's not just that the hysterical voices carried the day and that the government went back on its word. And, Chairman Bergen, who was one of the people who had been promising repeatedly on record in these public meetings where it was all written down what he was saying, repeatedly promising that mountain biking would be allowed and that it should be allowed and that he thought it was, quote, the right thing to do, unquote. He then turned around and he was one of the people who introduced the resolution that ultimately was voted on that killed the mountain biking plan. So they had been saying we're going to allow access, and then after 3 years of dragging it out, nothing happened except the consultant got paid. I guess it's New Jersey after all. But it was after all of this occurred that I sat there and I said to myself, I'm going to post game it and see what went wrong. So I filed my final Open Records Act request, and one of the things I was particularly interested in was about these flyers. These were printed up. Sometime, I don't know when, but sometime these were printed up and they were found by me the day after the vote, or I should say the day after the vote. So 2 weekdays after the vote. I think it was a Thursday and then a Friday and then Monday was when I found them. I don't remember, but I think it was a Thursday because I remember saying they had to have printed these up on a Friday after the vote, and I thought that was weird, wasn't it? Because up until then, as far as anybody knew, mountain biking was going to be allowed. They just haven't worked out the kinks. But now here they're saying ATVs and mountain bikes operated in Union County parks are subject to impoundment, and mountain biking and ATVs are prohibited in all Union County parks. Now, I don't know why and this is in keeping with the new signs they had made that they had posted August 2016. That's actually the symbol on the signs, and they talk about mountain biking and ATVs together. I don't know why. I honestly think that it's like a package deal thing. They're trying to make us seem as destructive as what are essentially four-wheeled motorcycles, that weigh hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds, whereas a mountain bike is, even the heaviest one's only going to weigh like 30 pounds. Most of them weigh less. But this is what they had on the flyers. And they have 2 ordinances here. One is the ordinance from 1983 that they say is about mountain biking, whether it is or not. And one is a separate ordinance about ATVs. Now, as far as the ordinance about mountain biking, again, it talks about roads, sidewalks, paths, and they don't actually contain it here. So you see roads, sidewalks, paths, and they leave off the part about cars. But if they were to put the whole ordinance in here, the last sentence would have said, and I don't know if they left it off because they didn't want to look even more stupid or because they just ran out of room. But the last sentence in that ordinance said, basically, and don't ride in such a way as to needlessly obstruct car traffic, motor vehicle traffic. So which obviously has nothing to do with the woods. But a lot of this other stuff doesn't either. Regulating how you ride on the roadway, sidewalks, paths, that doesn't have anything to do with the dirt trails that they're talking about, which are marked on maps as trails and have been for years and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so, and what's also noticeable, if you read this entire ordinance, the word trail doesn't appear in there. And of course, the stuff that is in there, and this is incomplete, it doesn't have that thing about cars, but the stuff that is in there, roads, sidewalks, paths, is not about the woods, right? It's about other stuff. So these were posted, and I thought it was, oh, that's an awful lot of work went into this. It's color, it's double-sided, and somebody had to approve the wording. So did they manage to do all that on the Friday after the vote? Now, I later found out that it was all done way back when they posted the new no bike signs in August of 2016, but I didn't know that at the time. I hadn't seen these until then. So I asked them, I filed an Open Record Act request for anything about first of all, if any changes to the contract with CME, documents amending the contract after the changes that were made when they decided to pay them extra for mountain biking, but not. Because I wanted to know if they were going to change the contract so these guys didn't get paid for not work they weren't going to have to do, or if they were going to just leave it as is after canceling the plan, and then they get paid for work that's been canceled, essentially. So we don't get trail access, but they get to line their pockets. I wanted to know if that was going to happen. The other stuff I asked about was about enforcement efforts, including the posting of these flyers, and I included a scanned copy of the flyer with my faxed Open Record Act request. I said the attached flyer, and I described it as it specifically, emails, correspondence, anything about approving the flyers and the wording and all of that. What I get back is an email that says, sorry, we can't provide that to you because it's been redacted. Okay. Now, they did provide some of the other stuff, but they couldn't provide anything on these flyers, and I thought that was weird. Because they said it was redacted for deliberative purposes. Here's the problem. The flyers are already printed. Deliberative means, deliberating. It means pondering a decision, debating a decision. There's no decision to debate with respect to printing up and publishing this flyer. It already exists. They were posted in kiosks around the park. So that didn't make any sense. And as far as if the deliberation was about mountain biking and whether or not to allow it or anything like that, or what the penalty should be, well, if you believe the government that an ordinance from 1983 about sidewalks and paths and roads is really about mountain biking or riding on the dirt trails in the park, if you believe that, and I'm not saying it is, but if you believe that, and that's what the government has been telling people they should believe, then the penalty for mountain biking was assessed when that ordinance was written in 1983, right? Conversely, if you're saying, well, was it about the decision of whether or not to allow mountain biking in the new trail plan, included in the new trail plan? Well, that was voted on May 18th, and they killed it. Although they're still paying the consultant, apparently. But I filed this Open Records Act request in summer of that year. The plan was killed in May. So, again, nothing's deliberative in that sense. So I said back, please describe to me specifically how something that has been decided, depending on who you talk to, months ago or decades ago, is still somehow deliberative. And then they got back, well, it's deliberative because it's part of the deliberative process. What process is that? I said, there's nothing that's ongoing. So I showed this to somebody I knew who was a lawyer, and they said, that's bullshit. Sue them. That's not a reasonable reason for redacting the information. So I sued them. I don't know what to say. I mean, they weren't providing the information they're required to provide by law. And after 3 years of wading through all this bullshit to just try and get a straight answer from my government about why I can't ride my bike in the damn park, I wanted to know what was going on. And the government was sitting on it, keeping it under its hat. So I said, well, gosh darn it, people get screwed by the government all the time. I intend to screw back. So I sued them. And I never thought I would do such a thing. But what can you do? They have to obey the rules too. Well, it turns out that Um, they had good reason to want to hide this. They eventually called up my lawyer and they settled the case. And I said to the lawyer, there's trustworthy as a bent wheel, so make sure you actually get all the information from them. But they agreed to settle the case, pay the several $1,000s that my lawyer rang up in costs, the several $100s in court costs, filing costs, and obviously their own lawyer charged them. So conceivably, this could have cost, the government, I don't know, $10,000 or something, maybe more. Who knows? I mean, I don't know how much their lawyer charges, but on my end, I mean, it was at least over $4,000. Of course, I got paid because they decided to settle and admit they were wrong and disclose the information. But the point is that, yeah, a lot of work just to find out why someone's trying to hide an email. But like everything else about this mountain bike ban, it doesn't make sense. And what the email said was, it was the government people talking amongst themselves about what to put on things like signs and these flyers. And it contained an email from the one of the people at the county police department who states in the email, we cannot take the bike just because somebody's riding in the park. That's misleading and we shouldn't put it on the signs. Yet, what do they say here? Right? If you're operating your bike in the park, you're threatened with impoundment. But then in the email, they say, well, we can't take their bike just because they're operating it in the park. That has nothing to do with this ordinance that they say is about mountain biking, whether it is or not, which they've put on this flyer. Now, there is a part of the Union County Code that does threaten to take your bike, but it's something else. It's some archaic requirement that you register your bike with your town, which nobody really does anymore or has for years. The fact that that's even still on the books only shows that they just really don't understand cycling in the modern world, or that they just don't go through their books and clean out all the old laws that are deadwood. That's my guess. But yeah, there is an old ordinance that says if your bike's not registered with your town and the government thinks because of that it may be stolen, they can confiscate your bike and you get it back if you prove it's yours. Since nobody registers their bike, I don't know how you prove it's yours. I guess you try to track down the bike shop that you originally bought it from, if you bought it new, and get the guy to write a letter saying, yeah, it's his bike, I guess. I don't know. But another problem with that ordinance is, well, you can get it back when you comply with the ordinance. But since people don't register their bikes anymore as a rule, I mean, if you went to a town and said, hey, town government, can you find me a 20-year-old or 30-year-old registration sticker from the bike boom years of the 70s and the 80s, they might be able to find one and they might actually sell it to you for $1 or whatever. But the point is that nobody's being pulled over on their bike on the street and asked to see their registration stickers. All right? And it's just as well. The reason these things, they existed along your already established legal rights of the road years ago, and then they could just kind of faded away before there could be a major court challenge to them. But I think nowadays, if somebody was to try and impose something like that, you would very quickly see that it would get nipped in the bud, and justly so. But the point is, okay, the fact that that's even on the books just shows how ignorant they are of cycling nowadays. I mean, it would be like if you had somebody who still had a law on the books that said, black people have to sit in the back of the bus. I mean, that's not only is that offensive, it's behind the times, right? So, same deal here. Nobody does that anymore, and there's a reason. But just like segregation is offensive to people who know anything about current policy, saying we're going to take your bike if you don't register it with your town, which nobody does anymore, so why would you do it? And why would failure to do it be in any way suspicious, since it's not something anybody does anyway anymore? That only shows how ignorant they are of cycling, I think. But the point isn't just that it's a stupid thing that nobody does anymore and it really is as out of place as disco. The point is that it's not based in that ordinance. And that's the only ordinance about bikes they put on this flyer. Again, this flyer has two ordinances. The one about ATVs and the one about bicycles. And the one about bicycles, whether you believe it authorizes a ban on mountain biking or bikes on the trails or not, The point is that it doesn't contain any threat or penalty of confiscation. That is from another ordinance that is not related to mountain biking, or the ordinance they say is related to mountain biking. It's not related to that, and it's something else. That's another part of the county code. It's not on this flyer. So they have an ordinance, and then they have a threat to impound your bike. The threat to impound your bike is not linked to that ordinance. And that's what they were admitting in the email that I had to sue them to get them to disclose. They said, we shouldn't put this on stuff. It's misleading to people. That's not correct. We cannot impound your bike just for it because it's operated in the park. But yet the flyer says mountain bikes operated in Union County parks are subject to impoundment. So on one hand, they said, we can't put this on the flyers. Hello, I'm letting you know it's misleading. Don't do it. On the other hand, what did they put on the flyers? Yeah, exactly what they said was misleading. So I think there's a very good reason why I had to sue them to get that information. They didn't want to admit that they lied to everybody when they had these published and printed up. They didn't want to admit that they threatened people with confiscating their property illegally, essentially, without the authorization to do so. In fact, flagrantly misstating the authorization they did have for whatever it's worth. And the point is, they knew they shouldn't be doing this. Why? Well, it's right there in that email exchange that I had to sue them to get. They were talking amongst themselves saying, we really shouldn't do this. But guess what? They did it anyway. Yeah. That, I think, sums up the whole history of the mountain bike ban. The government knows better. They know this isn't how they should conduct themselves, but they do it anyway. Because why not? Nobody seemed to have done much to hold them accountable so far. Myself and a handful of other riders did, again, get the ball rolling as far as mountain bike access is concerned. And at the end, there was a considerable amount of people supporting it. But the problem is it was never made about the government's conduct. The government kind of did a 180 and tried to turn it back. We had T-shirts printed up. The T-shirts didn't say mountain biking is safe. The T-shirts didn't say mountain biking should be allowed. The T-shirt said, free Watchung, open the res, right? Free Watchung, mountain biking is not a crime. That's what the T-shirt said. And the reason the T-shirt said that is because the issue was the government's policy as far as Watchung was concerned and not allowing you to ride there. The issue wasn't mountain biking, and it never was. And I think the fact that people didn't realize that no effort was really made to get them to realize that, to make it possible for them to realize that and see through the BS, that I think is really sad. Because, take any other example. If the government comes and wants to outlaw something or restrict something, and they do it in a way which is underhanded, without any evidence that it's a problem, without any clear legal authorization, etc., and then lie about that amongst themselves and to the public. And then you try to say, well, okay, we should have a fair policy, not this awful thing that you've concocted. And the government's response is, yeah, but the activity we banned is bad for the environment. Or it's unsafe. Some child may be hurt. You know what? That may be true. It's not necessarily true. But suppose it was. How does that make your ban any less unjust, unfounded, and, like pointless? The question isn't, can they do a good job with all the PR they're stirring up in terms of trying to condemn mountain biking? The question is, can they justify the ban on it, including the way it was imposed? And that's something that nobody's ever tried to do. The government or these other citizens who didn't want people riding in the park and wanted to keep it their own private fiefdom for like the 5 people that live near there and walk their dogs there or whatever. The problem I have with banning mountain biking in Watchung isn't just that people didn't get park access. It's that they didn't get access to their government either. This was done behind closed doors, without any documentation of a problem, without any public input, by the government's own admission. Supposedly authorized by an ordinance, even though it was the unelected who don't pass ordinances or everything to do with that and the things, supposedly authorized by an ordinance that was never linked in writing to the actual ban from 1995, until 2014, when I started asking questions about it. And then the fact that they're threatening to confiscate your property, a threat that they knew they shouldn't make because it was not legally authorized. But they printed up dozens, maybe hundreds of, tens of, dozens, hundreds of these things all over the parks. And that's another thing. It says here all county parks, right? Well, that just says in county parks. Here it says in all county parks. But even where it just says Union County Parks, you'll notice that's plural parks. S. The mountain bike ban was just about Watchung. You can go back to 1995 when they created it, and they passed this ordinance, in 1983, and then they officially recognized it in 93 instead of banning it. So obviously there was no ban beforehand. All of these things in the timeline, and then you get to 1995 when they actually banned it. Okay, they got together in a back room and they decided, let's ban mountain biking. What were they using? They were talking about Watchung. The mountain biking white paper, written to outline the government's proposed goals of this ban, talked about Watchung. It opens with the sentence, mountain biking in Watchung has dramatically increased over the last 5 years. Now, that not only puts to light the idea that there was a ban before that, but it also, what is it about? Mountain biking in the entire county, mountain biking in county parks generally? No, it's about Watchung. This has always been just about Watchung. Probably because that's the place where most people wanted to ride. These other parks only have a few miles of trail here or there. Watchung is ginormous by comparison. But the point is there are other parks with dirt trails that people could ride on, could bicycle on. I bicycled in the park by the Passaic River for years, which was never closed. Why? Because the ban on mountain biking was only about Watchung. It was created for Watchung, and it was about Watchung for over 20 years. Now, nearly a quarter century later, the government decided in 2016 when they put up these flyers and the signs, which had a similar logo, the new no bike signs. When they posted those in August of 2016, they posted them at every county park, not just Watchung where they had them before, but at other county parks. So we didn't just not get the trail, we didn't just not get the trail access they've been promising for 3 years. We lost trail access to every park in the county. Parks that had never been closed before. And that's pretty sad. One of the things I don't understand about this whole thing is, even if you like the idea of banning mountain biking or you don't like the idea of allowing mountain biking, so you think they should be banned, sit down and ask yourself what defense you have on any issue against bad government policy. The most basic defense, yes, we have constitutional rights, a Bill of Rights. We have at the state level certain other laws and restrictions on what the government can and can't do. At the county and local level, same thing. But at the end of the day, your most basic protection against the government doing something wrong is that you know what it is the government's doing. By supporting the existing ban on mountain biking in all of its, I'd say in all of its glory, but in all of its dishonor, essentially, you're not only supporting, if you support the current policy on banning mountain biking, you're not only supporting the idea of banning mountain biking as an abstract thing, but you're supporting everything about this current policy, including how it was implemented, the lies that people were told, the things that people just weren't informed about because it was done behind closed doors, all of that. So, if somebody wanted to sit down and have a discussion right now, should mountain biking be allowed at Watchung or not? Or should it be allowed at the whole park or just part of it? Should we allow people to use existing trails or just some of the existing trails? Or should we make new trails? If so, where? Let's have that discussion.